church was home to many wealthy Hispanic people, many doctors, lawyers, and merchants. It was like the rich side of town, the north side of the train tracks. And they moved there when she was in high school. And she was the first Hispanic twirler and head drum majorette. So she was actually last seen at church on Saturday, April 16th, 1960. She borrowed her family's car and said she would be right back. She just wanted to go to confession. It was around 6:30 at night, and it was the day before Easter. I don't believe she was planning to go to midnight mass, but she did want to at least go to confession. The church was Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, and it was about 12 blocks from her home. That night, many remembered seeing her, and because of her beauty, it was like hard to miss. So there were a lot of witnesses who saw her at the church. They saw her in line, in the confession line. And sorry guys, I just realized I didn't shut my bedroom door, so you might hear the heater come on and off. But if you've seen my videos before, you know that once I sit down, I can't move because Sheila, my cat, sits on my lap, so I can't do anything about it right now. Anyway, sorry. So a lot of people saw her at church. They saw her in the confession line. They saw her come in and do a small cross, however that happens. And then some say that they saw her step out of line as if she was turning to leave, but no one actually saw her leave the church. The next day, like I said, was Easter Sunday, and her car was still parked down the street from the Sacred Heart Church, and no one had seen her since. On Tuesday of that week, a man named P.W. Miller noticed only suffocation, but she also suffered a very hefty blow to her head. So, at this point, the town is terrified. They believe that there's a killer on the loose, of course, because these injuries could not have been sustained in any other way. And her things were just strewn across the landscape of the highway in town. There were a lot of rumors that it possibly could have been one of her ex-suitors. She had a lot of suitors at the time. She was dating, I think, 2 or 3 men, which wasn't out of the ordinary for her. She was beautiful, and it's not like she was doing it in secret. She was just going on like very innocent dates, just kind of seeing what was out there, who was out there. What did these men have to offer to her? Who would be a good partner for her in life? So there were rumors going around that it might have been one of her current suitors or an ex-suitor. Also, they thought that maybe it was like a transient or someone who was just driving through town. But apparently the most prevalent rumor, which people were even afraid to say out loud because it was such a religious community, was that a priest had killed her. So to give you a little context, like I said, this town was very religious. So Kolob writes in her article, this is a quote, "The theory that kept most of McAllen whispering never appeared in print. People wondered about it privately, in low voices, after children had gone to bed. Some made the sign of the cross and offered words of contrition for even entertaining such an unholy idea. Dios perdonanos, they said, God, please forgive us." So they were terrified that if they said out loud what they thought, that her murderer was a priest, that possibly God would not forgive them, or they would be excommunicated from the church, which was such an important part in these people's lives. So the police still didn't really have any physical evidence or leads at this point other than these unsubstantiated rumors. There were no fingerprints, no real witnesses to the crime. There was no real crime scene, or hair, or blood, or semen. The only lead that they did have was a muddy shoe print that was found on the banks of the canal about 4 blocks south of where her body had been found. And stuck in the print was a strand of her hair, so they were pretty sure that this shoe print was that of whoever killed Irene. There were some tire tracks and a faint imprint of the coat that she was wearing in the mud as well. But because it had rained so much, the ground was so saturated with water that you couldn't make out any details in the shoe print or the tire tracks. Detectives finish seminary school, and he was in town for a year of pastoral training. The patrons of the church didn't really like him. They thought that he was kind of cold, kind of aloof. They felt like, compared to the other priest who was there, Father O'Brien, that he wasn't as warm and welcoming. It seemed like he wasn't passionate about being a priest. He wasn't passionate about God or speaking the word of God. Seemed like he was just going through the motions. At first, Father Feit did say that he met with her in the rectory to privately discuss a question of conscience that she had. But then he sent her to the sanctuary where people normally gave confession to confess. But then, a couple weeks later, I believe, his story changed. He admitted that he actually took her confession privately in the rectory. Apparently, that is a big no-no. You're not supposed to do that. Your confession is supposed to be done where everyone else's confession is done, in the sanctuary. And it was considered to be highly inappropriate. Other parishioners said he seemed to be missing for long periods of time during confession. And when he came together with Father O'Brien, the other leader in the church, after midnight mass, he had strange scratches on his hands. Like, okay, here we go. A woman from a neighboring town named Maria Carrera came forward as well to say that she had been attacked a few weeks earlier at a Sacred Heart church in Edinburgh, about 10 miles from the church in McAllen. She told detectives that she noticed a dark-haired man in horn-rimmed glasses sitting at the back of the church alone, and he looked a lot like the creepy guy who had been staring at her from his blue and white sedan earlier that day. Father Feit had dark hair, and he wore distinct horn-rimmed glasses as well. But she didn't think anything of it because she was in the house of God. So she went to the altar to pray. And then she was attacked. She was attacked from behind, and whoever attacked her tried to put a rag over her mouth as well. She was able to get a hold of his finger and bite down so hard that he started to bleed. She was able to get away, and she ran out the side door. She made a statement to police about this, and this was before Irene's murder. She said she thought her attacker was a priest, which was difficult for her to say, because like we talked about before, accusing a priest of something like that was unheard of. So she was very brave to do that. Again, there was a lot of pressure to keep this quiet because priests were considered to be literal men of God. So at the Sunday Mass, after Irene's funeral, Father O'Brien said that he knew rumors were going around that a priest had committed this crime. And he said, and this is a quote, "It is impossible that a priest would commit a crime like this. Don't speak of it. Don't even let yourselves think it." was asked to come in to give a full account of his actions on Easter weekend, and I wanted to read directly from the article on this. It's a quote. I think she puts it really well. So she says, this is what he said. He said that Saturday night he had counseled Irene in the Sacred Heart Rectory. He had last seen her, he claimed, when they exited the rectory between 7:15 and 7:20 p.m. Afterward, he had heard confessions for several hours in the sanctuary, and twice returned to the rectory to smoke cigarettes. As he had sat in the confessional that night, he had accidentally broken his glasses, he said. He had a nervous habit of playing around with them. When he had to listen to parishioners talk for any length of time, he explained. At 10 o'clock, he drove to his residence in the pastoral house of the Oblate Fathers, 5 miles away in San Juan, to get his other pair of glasses. He said upon arriving there, he had found that the doors were locked and that he had no key. And then he said, because of this, I had to make my entrance through a second-floor balcony, propping up a wooden roadblock or barricade against the side of the house, and climbing in this fashion. While entering the house in this way, I scraped the back of my hand slightly, and the index finger and middle finger of my left hand more severely on the brick wall. Okay, let's unpack that for a minute. So, he really has no witnesses showing or saying that they saw him climbing into a second-story window. He's explaining away these weird scratches that showed up on his hand after Irene was murdered. And he's explaining away the injury that he got on his finger after Maria said that she bit her attacker on his hand. And he's explaining it away in a ridiculous way. But that's his account. He never explained how his slide viewer ended up where Irene's body was found. And when they questioned him about the attack on Maria Guerra, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, I'm not very good at Spanish. In Edinburgh, he admitted to being in the church at the time that Maria said he was, and he admitted to driving a blue and white sedan. But he insisted that he had left an hour before the attack. He explained that the injury on his finger, he had another explanation for the injury on his finger. He said he got it caught in a photocopy machine, basically. I think it's called like a mimeograph machine, like an old school photocopier. But the other priests did not corroborate his story. They in fact said that he had never hurt himself on the photocopier. And he was picked out of a lineup by Maria and another eyewitness. The best polygraph team in the nation at the never indicted for Irene's murder, despite the fact that most people knew that he did it. And I believe he was never indicted, and I mean, most people feel the same way. It's because he was a man of the church, and the church protected him, and people were afraid to formally bring him to trial for this. 42 years later, in April 2002, the San Antonio Police Department received a call from a man who said he was a former priest, and he was living in Oklahoma City at that time in 2002, and his name was Dale Tacheney, Tacheny. He said that he had worked in a monastery in Missouri in 1963, but had since left the priesthood. During his time at the monastery, he had met another priest, and he had counseled this priest who had come from the San Antonio area. The priest said that he had attacked a young woman and had murdered her on Easter weekend. The detective he called was skeptical because detectives who work on cold cases get a lot of leads, and a lot of them are hoaxes, and many of the leads that they got in the Irene case were hoaxes. But despite his skepticism, he asked Dale to put his statement in writing and to mail it to him. So he finally got the letter, but the detective who got the letter couldn't figure out which case it corresponded to. And that's because Irene's case was in McAllen, which was not in San Antonio. So he put the letter aside until Thanksgiving of that year, when he got lucky and a Texas Ranger had stopped by the office just to pick something up, and he happened to mention Irene's case. He happened to mention this woman who had been murdered Easter weekend, supposedly by a priest, and alarm bells went off in his head. He was like, "Are you serious? I have this letter from a former priest who says he knows who did it. Like, here it is. Let's compare notes." And they started to reopen the case. So here we go. We're gonna get him, right? No. John Feit had left the priesthood in 1972 and had gone on to live a quiet life. He got married and had children in Phoenix, Arizona, after being sent to a home for troubled priests. Now, I think I'm naive because I didn't know that there was such a thing. This home, these types of homes, housed priests at the time who had been accused of molesting children, and apparently who had confessed to murders. So it was basically a place where the church could cover up these terrible things that these men had done, because they believed that God would give them a greater punishment than our justice system ever could. Okay, so when the Texas Rangers reopened the case, Feit was 69 years old. Irene would have been 67. And Dale, the priest who had called the detectives, made a long drive to San Antonio, and he was an old man at this point too. And he decided to tell detectives more of what he knew. He said that his supervisor at the monastery in Missouri knew of a priest in monastery who had murdered a woman, and Dale's supervisor asked him to counsel this priest, this murderer. Dale said that he had kept quiet about it for 40 years out of religious obligation, but in his old age, he realized he didn't want to be part of a cover-up. This is from the article, and this is what Feit had told Dale at the monastery. Father Feit had asked her to come to the church rectory, and her is Irene. Had asked Irene to come to the church rectory and had heard her confession there. After the confession, he had restrained the woman. Dale thought that she might have been bound and gagged, but he was not certain, and he had sexually assaulted her. Before he returned to the sanctuary to hear her confessions, he had moved her to the rectory basement. Later that evening, or in the days that followed, he moved her to another location. Then, on Easter Sunday, he put her in a bathtub and placed a bag over her head and suffocated her. He heard her saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." When he came back later that day, or early evening, she was dead in the bathtub. And then that night, at what hour he wasn't sure, he put her in the car that was available to him and removed her and dropped her off along the roadside where there was a canal. He didn't show any kind of compunction or sorrow or grief or anything like that. And he felt at the time appalled by what had come about, but it wasn't Dale's job to judge him under God. Apparently it was God's job to judge Feit for what he had done. So Dale had kept this quiet for 40 years. I just can't imagine doing that. And Dale was not the only person who knew about it. So we have Dale's supervisor, and then, sorry, this gives me chills, Father O'Brien, who was the priest at the Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, said that he had suspected Feit from the start, and that summer he told him everything. Feit confessed to Father O'Brien that summer. Father O'Brien kept it to himself also for section of straight, orderly streets that led north from the airport toward his condominium. 2 weeks earlier, I had sent Feit a letter asking if he might tell me his side of the story, and had received no response. Others had also come to the desert to talk to him. Christine Galvin, a pretty young TV reporter from the valley, had put a microphone in his face and asked, "Did you kill Irene Garza?" With little luck. I knocked on the front door and waited. What sounded like a small dog padded around inside, his toenails clicking on the tile floor. After a while, a man came to the door. He was neatly dressed in a plaid button-down shirt and tan slacks, and he was taller than I had expected. His hair had thinned, and he had gone soft in the middle. He was no longer the serious man in the Roman collar and horn-rimmed glasses. Beyond him, through the door, was a tidy living room where sun streamed in through the windows. His wife did not appear to be home, but there was a kitchen table in an alcove where, I imagined, they probably drank coffee and talked about their grandchildren. I wondered what he had told her or not told her while they sat at that table. He greeted me with a genial smile. I introduced myself, explaining that I had come all the way from Texas. I said that I would appreciate a few minutes of his time to talk about Irene. For an instant, his brown eyes widened behind the glasses. Then he shook his head, graciously declining to be interviewed. "I know you have a job to do," he said, "but I'm sorry, I can't do that." He stood there for a moment, as if pondering what to do next. There were many things he could have said that he did not. That he was innocent, that Irene's murder had been a senseless crime, that he was tired of strangers knocking on his door, asking about a terrible thing that had happened a long time ago. Instead, he said something that I would think back to many times in the weeks to come. "The speculation intrigues me," he said. Then, as he turned to shut the door, he added, "God bless you, dear." And that was that. I was so mad when I finished this article, but thank God, no pun intended, a jury convicted Feit finally on December 8th, 2017. The DA, the original DA, was voted out of office, and a new DA came in and agreed to hear the case and give Irene's family some closure. 48 Hours did an episode on this, you might have seen it. So, John Feit finally went to jail. After 57 years